Good morning, and thank you all very much for this opportunity. We would like to give our thanks to Professor Wang Wei and also to Professor Jing for all of the hospitality and the interactions here at the conference. So, as is our usual custom, we'll both be presenting this speech about the archaeological research at Sisupalgarh. So, to place this material in context, we first wanted to start by mentioning that there are, of course, two phases of urbanism in the Indian subcontinent with which you may be familiar. And one of them is the Indus period from approximately 2500 to 1900 BCE. And then there is a considerable hiatus of large-scale settlement until the early historic period, starting approximately 800 BCE. And that is the focus of our presentation here today. This period of time in the Indian subcontinent is one in which there is not only the development of urbanism, as you see in the central slide, which shows you a contemporary depiction of ancient urban life from India, but it is also the time of the beginning of Buddhism as a cultural and religious tradition. And it is the time in which there is a writing system which we can read that provides information about history, ritual, economics, and so on. In the early historic period, that is this time period of the first millennium BC, there were approximately 100 settlements of size that can be called urban in the Indian subcontinent. And our particular focus of research is at the location of Sisupalgarh, which is located on the eastern coast of India.
The site Sisupalgarh is located very close to the modern city of Bhubaneswar, the capital of Orissa. And the city, you can see from the Google Earth very clearly the layout of the city. If you get into just to type the Sisupalgarh, it is about 1 kilometer in all the sides, like 1.4 square kilometer, the area, and has got 2 gateways in each side, comprising of 8 gateways. If you put the line straight from each gateway, it divides the city into 9 squares. And there is a fortification or kind of rampart running around the city. Is about 12 to 13 meter high as it is seen today, but it would have been much higher than when it was initially built in several phases. The city is again surrounded by a moat which runs all around and drains into the nearest river there. And in the center of the city, you can see the kind of pillars. Now the remaining about 13 pillars, but there are many pillars. There are many pillars which you will be seeing later. And the gateways, impressive gateways, you can see that each side is about 30 meter to 40 meter length gateways, which one enters to the city. Then we see the kind of problems which we wanted to look into the city, because the city was excavated in 1948 by Professor B.B. Lal, soon after the Indian independence. And by then, we didn't have much of dating because it was only chronological dating. We wanted to see absolute dating of the city when it began, because this place, especially the city, belongs to one territory, which is Kalinga. Kalinga was one of the most important territorial administrative organization during about the beginning of first millennium BC. But very little was known till certain events took place, which we will be seeing later. And then we wanted to see that how the city was laid out in different ways of how the house structures were there and how the internal and external settlements were there in the city itself. And then we wanted to see the kind of relationship, political relationship within the regional context, as well as also outside the regional context. Then we had different kind of survey, in that geophysical surveys and electrical probing surveys. But however, the geophysical survey gave us a very good a result of the city layout, because it was very difficult to excavate in a larger area, because some part of the city, the site is been occupied by the present villages. So that's how we saw that to find out the best localities to excavate and see that we can get the best result. So the geophysics probe showed that there was straight roads crisscrossing the main gateways, making the city into 9 squares. There were lanes and bylanes, straight lines, and in the each lane by lane had houses opposite each other. This is how we can see the city layout, the cities in the roads and bylanes. Then we took several places. We excavated in 7 localities. One of the localities where we excavated, the house structures were so organized that probably the city was well controlled by the administrators, as each house had almost the similar kind of space, but each individual house could operate within their space given. So in some cases, the same space could have 3 rooms, and some spaces it could have 4 rooms and a veranda or a kind of opening space. So that's what it was controlled, that the city, the layout was controlled, and the house constructions were controlled. And in between the houses, there were open spaces where the common utility area could be used for the different purposes as such.
So in the habitation areas at Sisupalgarh, we found a wide variety of different kinds of daily use goods, not only an enormous amount of pottery, but also a tremendous variety of what we could call cheaply manufactured ordinary goods. And so we found, for example, at least 1,000 terracotta ornaments. These are bangles and bracelets and pendants and other types of ornamentation that show the availability of large quantities of decorative items that people were able to get in the marketplaces, so that the amount of discard that we had indicates that the kind of thing that we see in modern cities of a large amount of trash and fast forward recycling is something that we also see in ancient settlements as well. And here you can see an additional demonstration of some of the very fine molded decorations that would have been produced in large quantities. We could also see that in the habitation areas, as Professor Mohanty mentioned, that there was a lot of idiosyncratic as well as planned settlements. And so that the houses were of varying sizes and varying qualities of construction. But we also saw that the houses were predominantly made of permanent materials, such as bricks and tiles, which were quite distinct from the earlier Neolithic and Chalcolithic habitations of the area, so that ordinary people in a city would have experienced a scale of architecture not only from the large monumental components of the environment, but also from the daily lives that they enjoyed in their own habitations. You can also see here the kinds of habitation areas and the reuse of materials, a lot of innovations in the types of structures, in the types of courtyards, and in the types of roofing materials that people were able to access in the city. There was also within the area of the archaeological site some very impressive monolithic pillars that comprised monumental architecture. And these pillars, of course, had been standing for thousands of years, but their configuration was something of a mystery. We had the opportunity to investigate in the area of one of these pillar groupings from a local gentleman who was the landowner of this site, and he graciously gave us permission to go and investigate in his field and to examine the areas of the pillars to see if we could make sense of this pillar configuration. So in the course of the excavation of this area, we found an additional 18 pillars that comprise this large area of certainly ritual or special purpose architecture in the center of the site. And once again, the scale of this is evident from the ways in which we can envision many more as yet undiscovered pillars that remain in the central portion of the site. So each one of these ladies is standing in a place where we anticipate that there would have been an additional pillar as part of this large construction. The central zone seems to have had very little trash compared to the areas of the domestic habitation, which suggests that the ordinary lives of people within the site were constrained and understood as different spatial areas for different kinds of activities.
Here we come to a change in the political scenario in all of the subcontinent, which affected the Southeast Asia, including China, Japan, and Myanmar, Thailand, Korea, and everything. To a great extent, this was the Kalinga War, which took place in 269 BC. And by then, the Magadhan Empire, one of the important Janapadas, or the city-states, which had already occupied from or conquered from Afghanistan to down south in Indian subcontinent, had not touched the Kalinga Empire till then, which was its neighboring state itself. But the war which Asoka, the Kalinga, the Magadhan king took place, describes many events of the war, which probably he tells in two of his inscriptions, saying that he killed about 100,000 soldiers and captured 60,000, probably devastating whole population, the eligible warriors of the Kalinga, then Kalinga. But what happened that he changed his religion from Jainism to Buddhism and accepted Buddhism as one of the state religion and started propagating Buddhism in the neighboring countries during his ruling period, and subsequently Buddhism took place in such a firm way that it moved to different parts of the world itself. So what we see is here that what we saw, that upper portion of the settlement, because the lower portion of the settlement is difficult to excavate because the water table is so high that only by employing the pumps or kind of water removing bodies, or you can go down in a very limited area. But however, we took in 3-4 places going down to the earliest level, and we see that the city begins around 800 to 700 BC and continues to about 3rd, 4th century AD. So here is the Kalinga War which takes place. So that much earlier to the Kalinga War, the city was already laid and it was very prosperous, and that's how the probably it was such an important place and important organization, so that it was not possible for a mighty ruler like the Magadhan ruler to conquer during this, their heydays.
When we had completed 5 seasons of excavation at Sisupalgarh, we had the welcome opportunity to consider additional research in the region. And this had all been sanctioned by the Archaeological Survey of India, which is the government body that grants permissions for excavations and for other research. And as researchers, we faced what you might see as a familiar kind of quandary, and that is, should we continue to work at Sisupalgarh, which is a large site that could easily take an entire lifetime of investment and more? Or did we want to try to understand urbanism from a more expansive hinterland perspective? And we chose the latter. We chose to step away from Sisupalgarh and look at some of these surrounding regions to understand the impact that urbanism had on its surroundings. So we went out into these economic and ritual landscapes of the local region and subsequently investigated human environmental dynamics that are governed by this operative environmental premise, which is a hot summer followed by the monsoon, which then brings in an abundance of water that is particularly suitable for the kinds of rice cultivation that can then support large urban populations. And in the local regions of Orissa, we have been doing some ethnoarchaeological research, and then there is a large team from University College London, including Dr. Emma Harvey and others who have done research on the long-standing cultivation of rice in the region of Orissa. And our subsequent research has encompassed joint projects and individual projects in this entire eastern plain of the coastal region of Odisha, including a series of settlements that we'll talk about just briefly, one slide each, of various sites starting with the Neolithic period at the site of Ostapur.
So when we saw that the settlement at Sisupalgarh is beginning around 8th century BC, we wanted to know that how the cities or the urbanization began in this part of the subcontinent. So we wanted to see that the precedent or the early sites which we could find and could excavate. So there was very little research earlier prior to this, our excavations regarding the early phase of the settlements over there. So we did an extensive exploration, and we could find about more than 35 sites. By now we have reached about 50 sites of Neolithic, Chalcolithic, leading to the early historic cultures. So this is one of the sites, Ostapur, which began around, say, 2000 BC. It has got the early phase of Neolithic in this region, where we get in the early level the kind of handmade pottery, gradually emerging to be wheel-made pottery. And the initial phase, we see a lot of wild rice being exploited, which is found in the neighboring areas till today. And it probably, that's how the settlements came in a kind of alluvium plain with lots of wild rice and wild fauna, wild flora available. So gradually grew to be settled life, and occupation continued. And subsequently, at later stage, around 1000 BC or so, most of the sites we see that getting abandoned. We do not know that what made them to abandon, but suddenly around 8th century BC, we see that the cities are emerging. What we see that here, they are having circular houses, model wattle and dwarf structures, and a series of constructions. The abandonment of sites doesn't show that it was a kind of calamities or kind of some kind of devastation or climatic conditions which has driven them out, but certainly it had something to do. Probably most of the people were trying to move out to the cities, newly formed cities, and few residents were staying back in the settlements to do the agricultural and other activities. So we did another site again to see that our hypothesis or our kind of assumptions are going right with the kind of findings which we have seen in one of the sites which I told previously. And then we did a site called Globalization, which is very close in between the sites which will be showing that excavated. So it is again begins with Neolithic, Chalcolithic, continues to the early medieval period. So that, but however, the period which the city emerged, Sisupalgarh, 8th century to 3rd century, is missing from this site. So that it made us interesting point to see that where we can find the link of this site to the Sisupalgarh. Certainly, when we are excavating Sisupalgarh, we discovered the site Talpada, which is just across the river, the site where we have excavated at Globalization.
So as we were working with a team of people consistently through the Sisupalgarh and other excavations, there was the opportunity to investigate sites in the region that led to the discovery of 2 additional sites that were very much on the model of Sisupalgarh, but at a considerable distance. Talapada, which is about 40 kilometers away, and Lati, which is about 150 kilometers away, but clearly taking their architectural inspiration from the large urban center. These excavations showed, however, that while those smaller town-sized sites were certainly planned, they were not inhabited to the same extent as Sisupalgarh. So much thinner deposits and our very extensive geophysical surveys, again run by Dr. Timothy Matney, who had done the work at Sisupalgarh, and a number of excavations at the site of Talapada revealed that we had something of a mix between a Neolithic lifeway in terms of architecture and yet certainly the same kinds of pottery and other types of materials that we found at Sisupalgarh. So what we had were these small settlements in the hinterlands of an urbanizing landscape that owed much of their activities and their architectural inspiration to the genuine city, but that were built on a much smaller and more modest scale. So here is the gateway at Talapada, which was of all the gateways at Talapada, the only one that was embellished, much smaller on scale than Sisupalgarh. And here by comparison, you can see Sisupalgarh as having its massive rampart and gateway, and Talapada having only a small suggestion of the same.
Looking back and forth, then we wanted to see that what exactly happened after the site was abandoned and at Sisupalgarh. So we thought of looking into some kind of later sites, and we came across a site very close to the seashore, Manikpatna, which is a port site. We excavated that, and it was established it came into existence about 6th century AD, continued to about 1900 AD. So different, the site, as it was located near the seashore and it was convenient for as a port site, it acted as a kind of transit port for transit exchange port for the hinterland, as well as for the seafaring ships coming from different parts of the east coast, as well as from the other parts of the Southeast Asian countries, including China. You have the Chinese coin, and you have also Chinese ceramics coming from this site. And then we looked into another site, Gorangpatna, which is located again in the Chilka Lake. It's very close to the site of Talpada. Wanted to see that what kind of activity it had. It had the same kind of cultural material which we found at Sisupalgarh at Talpada, dating back to about 8th, 9th century BC. And then what we had here is that lot of ceramics, which comes from different parts of the hinterland, as well as also coming from outside the hinterland, coming from the northern India, as well as from some of the objects coming from the South India itself. So there is a kind of, and this is contemporary to the Sisupalgarh. So by then we come to know that the trading activity or the kind of seafaring activity was already evident from the very early phase, like around 8th, 7th, 8th century BC, and continued to about 17th, 18th century AD in this part of the subcontinent itself.
So in this year itself, we have also been excavating another site on the shores of Chilka Lake, looking again at the hinterland perspective on urbanism that we see throughout this region of the eastern coastal plains of India. How do all these things fit together then? How do we understand the longitudinal development of human history and environmental dynamics relative to this large and successful urban settlement of Sisupalgarh? What we see in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic phases is a successfully populated countryside, but with a very limited range of material goods. What we see in the city at this time is the kind of impressive monumental architecture that we do not get anyplace else, but also the impressive domestic architecture that people from all walks of life were able to enjoy in the urban environment. And don't forget, as we have heard from earlier colleagues, the idea of urban bling, the kinds of things that people come into cities for in terms of entertainment and education and employment are all things that we can see developing in the urban center, but things that we would not have been able to see had we not stepped back from the city to look at the surrounding hinterlands. And we would like to give our great thanks to all of you here in the audience and to the many, many agencies and individuals who have supported our research over time. Shisha.
Thank you very much, Professor Monica Smith and Professor Mohanty.